When the war in the Pacific began in December 1941, Japan believed it was at the peak of its air power. I remember how, in the first months of the conflict, Japanese victories seemed endless. The Imperial Navy pilots were trained with almost fanatical discipline, and the planes they flew, especially the Mitsubishi A6M-0, they seemed invincible. The Zero was light, agile, and had a range that put Western fighters at a disadvantage. Within a few months, the Japanese dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaysia, and even the waters around Australia. The American and British pilots who first encountered the Zero were surprised by its maneuverability. Many of them, still clinging to World War I tactics, discovered the hard way that aerial combat had changed. But from the Japanese point of view, this was a source of pride. Each victory reinforced the idea that Japan had achieved air supremacy in the Pacific. The pilots believed themselves invincible, and who could blame them? Their fighters could perform impossible turns, their combat formation was impeccable, and troop morale was sky high. But while the Japanese Empire expanded, something was beginning to change on the other side of the ocean. The United States, shaken by the attack on Pearl Harbor, reacted with an industrial and technological fury that no one in Japan could have imagined. In a short time, the Americans began designing new fighter jets with a completely different philosophy. Heavier, more robust planes equipped with brutally powerful engines. To Japanese engineers, this seemed like a mistake. To Japanese pilots, an exaggeration. But the Americans knew what they were doing. While Japan believed that lightness and maneuverability would guarantee victory, the United States was betting on power, speed, and firepower. It was a race between two opposing doctrines of aerial combat. And I can say that, initially, nobody in Japan believed that those robust American machines could compete with the elegance and agility of the Zeros. The accounts of Japanese pilots from that era reveal this almost blind confidence. Many described the Zero as an extension of their own bodies. They flew with pride and believed that the enemy would never dominate the skies of the Pacific. But what they didn't know was that this confidence would soon turn into bewilderment and then into despair, because the skies of the Pacific were about to be taken over by a new generation of American fighters that would change everything. From 1943 onwards, Japanese pilots began to realize that something was wrong. Combat was no longer so easy. Their once untouchable planes were beginning to fall in alarming numbers, and the feeling of superiority began to fade as new names emerged on the combat radios. Hellcat, Corsair Lightning, and later, the legendary Mustang. It was the beginning of a new era, and the Japanese pilots were about to discover the price of arrogance. When the first rumors about new American planes began circulating among the Japanese ranks, many of us thought it was just propaganda. The enemy, after all, always exaggerates its achievements. But in mid-1943, that illusion vanished the moment our pilots returned from missions in the South Pacific with disturbing reports. They spoke of enemy fighters that not only withstood Japanese fire, but climbed faster, dove with terrifying force, and worst of all, returned home almost intact. It was during this period that new names began to appear in our sights. Names that would change the aerial balance of the war. F-6F, Hellcat, F-4U Corsair, and the P-38 Lightning. Each of these aircraft represented a different philosophy. But they all had one thing in common. They were extremely powerful. I remember reading the reports from the first encounters with the Hellcat, and it was almost unbelievable. Our veterans, who had fought in the Philippines and at Midway, said that the new American fighter seemed to withstand impacts that would destroy any Zero. They called it the flying tank, because even when hit by 7.7-meter machine guns and 20-millimeter cannons, the Hellcat kept flying. That was a shock to us. We were used to light fighters with little armor and no protected fuel tanks. The Hellcat, on the contrary, was almost the opposite of the Zero in every aspect. Heavy, robust and armed with 650 BMG machine guns, capable of setting an aircraft ablaze in seconds. Shortly after, their 4U Corsair, with its wings folded in an inverted gull shape and an unmistakable roar. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine sounded like thunder in the Pacific skies. I remember an account from a Japanese pilot who said, "When the Corsair dove, it felt like hell itself was coming after you." And it was true. The Corsair could reach impressive speeds and, unlike our fighters, had the power to escape a fight whenever it wanted. And then came the P-38 Lightning, a silver monster with 2 fuselages and twin engines. At first, many of us didn't even know for sure how to face it. The Lightning had enormous range and could operate at altitudes that the Zero couldn't reach. Its armament, concentrated in the nose, made each burst precise and deadly. It was the P-38, after all, that shot down the Admiral's plane, Isoroku Yamamoto, the man behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, a devastating blow to Japanese morale. These new planes represented more than just war machines. They were a symbol of what the United States had become, an industrial power capable of producing hundreds of fighter jets a month, each one better, faster, and more durable than the last. Meanwhile, we, on the Japanese side, were beginning to face shortages of materials, fuel, and, even worse, experienced pilots. The rookies arriving at the bases had only a few hours of flying experience and were thrown against enemies who possessed superior tactics and technology. Many did not return. The old maneuvering tactics, which had guaranteed us so many victories at the beginning of the war, were now useless. The enemy no longer accepted our rules. They climbed in vertical dives, attacked with brutal speed, and retreated before we could react. And with each mission, the bewilderment grew. The veteran pilots returned speechless, their gazes vacant. No one understood how the Americans had achieved such superiority in such a short time. It was the beginning of the decline of Japanese air supremacy, and for many of us, the moment we realized that the war had changed forever. When we realized that American fighter jets were dominating the skies, our first reaction was to try to adapt our tactics. After all, for years, Japanese combat doctrine had been based on maneuverability, lightness, and the individual skill of the pilot. Since the 1930s, we had trained for close-range combat, where instinct and personal skill made all the difference. Dogfight, hand-to-hand combat in the air, was our specialty. But with the arrival of the new American fighters, that stopped working. I remember the instructions we received. Enter the turn, force the enemy to spin, and win through agility. That was the mantra of the Zero pilots. But now, the enemy wouldn't accept that type of combat. The Americans learned quickly from their initial defeats. They began to adopt what they called boom and zoom, dive at high-speed fire, and then climb rapidly without getting caught in long turns. This tactic took advantage of the weight and power of the new fighters, which could escape before our lighter aircraft could react. We tried to respond. We changed the formations, reinforced the training, and even tried to develop new aircraft models, such as the Kawanishi N1K Shiden and the Nakajima Ki 84. Hayate, these fighters were powerful and, in theory, could compete with the Americans. But the problem was another. We no longer had enough pilots to fly them efficiently. The veterans had died in previous battles, and the new recruits were trained hastily with limited fuel and few flight hours. Many didn't even master basic combat techniques before being sent to the front. Meanwhile, the Americans were doing the opposite. Their pilots received hundreds of hours of simulator training, flew with experienced instructors, and learned group tactics. They flew in organized squadrons, communicating constantly by radio. We on the Japanese side still relied too much on individual skill and too little on coordination. And that began to cost us dearly. I remember a mission over the Solomon Islands where a Japanese squadron of 10 Zeros was surprised by just 4 Hellcats. At first, we thought it would be easy. But the Hellcats attacked from above, at high speed, destroyed 2 of our planes on the first pass, and disappeared into the clouds before we could fight back. When they returned, they came from another angle, and 3 more Zeros were shot down. It all happened in less than 3 minutes. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. From that point on, our post-flight meetings became silent. No one wanted to admit it, but we knew the Zero era had passed. Our planes were too fragile, and our tactics were stuck in a past that no longer existed. We tried to adapt to the use of altitude, dive attacks, and even energy warfare. But the technical performance of American aircraft made everything more difficult. Furthermore, we began to suffer from another problem: the loss of fuel and high-quality materials. Japanese engines, especially radial ones, began to experience constant mechanical failures. The metal alloys were inferior, and the planes were leaving the factories with defects. Meanwhile, the Americans were mass-producing machines with interchangeable parts and simple maintenance. It was as if we were fighting with swords against cannons. Even so, there was a sense of honor among us. We continued fighting, even knowing that the odds were dwindling every day. The commanders still spoke of samurai spirit and will to win. But deep down, we knew that technological warfare had surpassed courage. Skill was no longer enough. And when the Pacific skies began to fill with Hellcats and Corsairs, Japanese pride turned to silence and then to fear. As the months passed, it became impossible to ignore a brutal truth. Japan was being swallowed up by the United States industrial machine. I remember the exact moment I realized this. We were at a makeshift base in Rabaul, and an American squadron had attacked us the day before. When the sun rose, smoke was still rising from some destroyed hangars. We lost 5 planes, all beyond repair. The enemy, however, lost only 1. The next day, they returned with more than 20 fighters. It was as if they had an endless supply of men and machines, and indeed they did. American production capacity was simply unbelievable. While Japan struggled to manufacture a few hundred fighter planes per month, the United States produced thousands. And it wasn't just the quantity, it was the quality. Each new American model was improved, faster, more durable. Hellcat, for example, it was constantly updated. The Corsair, it received engine and armament adjustments. And the P-51 Mustang, when it finally reached the Pacific, it seemed like a celestial feat of engineering. It was fast, elegant, and lethal. We couldn't compete with that. Our pilots were tired, the mechanics exhausted, and resources were dwindling. Fuel was rationed to the point where we could barely train. Every drop of gasoline was saved for real missions, and that meant our rookies were taking off without experience. I saw 20-year-olds getting into a Zero for the first time and going straight into combat. It was like sending a trainee up against a world champion. The psychological situation also began to crumble. At the beginning of the war, flying to Japan was a source of pride. We were seen as heroes, and the people believed in our invincibility. But in 1944, the reality was different. Every day, fewer planes returned. The bases were increasingly empty, and the sound of enemy engines echoed without resistance. The feeling of powerlessness was suffocating. I remember one night sitting on the airfield deck and listening to the distant sound of American bombers passing by. We had no way to intercept them. We were out of fuel. All we could do was look to the sky and hope the next attack wouldn't fall on us. It was a feeling of humiliation that no Japanese pilot had ever experienced before. The national pride that had fueled us since the beginning of the war now weighed like an open wound. The Americans, on the other hand, fought with ever-increasing morale. They knew they had mastery of production, technology, and training. Their bases were full of new and spare aircraft. When a fighter was damaged, another was already ready to replace it. In Japan, when a plane was lost, it was a tragedy. When a pilot died, it was an irreparable loss. Japanese strategists attempted to reverse the situation by developing new projects, such as N1K Shiden Kaithaki 84 Hayate, and even the J2M Raiden, but they arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Japanese industry could no longer supply the parts, and the factories were constantly being bombed. It was a race we couldn't win. Gradually, we began to understand that the war in the air would not be decided solely by the skill of the pilots, but by capacity to sustain the war effort. And in that, the United States was unbeatable. They had fuel, metal, technology, and above all, time. We only had courage. And courage alone doesn't win aerial battles. With each new mission, the feeling among the pilots was a mixture of duty and despair. Some still believed we could turn the tide. Others simply flew because it was what they knew how to do. And it was in this scenario of loss and resignation that a new kind of mentality began to emerge. One that would transform how the world viewed Japan. A mentality of absolute sacrifice, born from despair and wounded honor. But that transformation was yet to come. Before that, many of us tried to keep fighting, believing that the war could still be won with bravery and faith. We didn't know that the worst was yet to come, and that the skies of the Pacific would soon be the stage for the most extreme acts of courage and desperation ever seen in the history of aviation. There was a moment in 1944 when we all realized that the war could no longer be won by conventional means. The enemy had taken control of the sky and the sea, and our forces were reduced to fragments of what they had once been. It was then that I first heard a word that would forever change the fate of Japanese pilots, kamikaze, the divine wind. The idea emerged amidst despair. The battles of Leyte Gulf and Filipinas, they showed that our fighter jets, even the most modern ones, were incapable of stopping the American formations. Our planes no longer had the range, power, or armor necessary to face the waves of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Mustangs who patrolled the Pacific. The American aircraft carriers seemed to appear out of nowhere, and their fleets launched hundreds of planes a day. We simply couldn't keep up. It was in this context that some officers began to propose something radical, using the aircraft themselves as a weapon, turning sacrifice into strategy. At first, I thought it was just a passing idea, a desperate proposal. But I soon realized it wasn't. Within a few weeks, official orders began to arrive to form special units, kamikaze units. I still remember the day I attended the first farewell ceremony. Young pilots, many under 20, lined up in front of their planes, receiving flags, swords, and messages from their families. Some cried quietly, others smiled, and everyone knew they wouldn't be returning. The silence at that airfield was too heavy to describe. The sound of the engines starting seemed like a lament from the depths of the soul. When they took off, no one applauded. We just looked at the sky and waited for the distant sound of the explosion. These attacks began to have an immediate effect. Reports showed that despite the pain and human cost, the kamikazes were causing serious damage to American ships. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, and cruisers were hit, and dozens of ships were sunk or severely damaged. For the first time in a long time, the enemy was showing surprise. But we knew this wouldn't change the course of the war. It was merely an attempt to delay the inevitable. From a psychological standpoint, the kamikazes deeply divided Japanese pilots. Many saw in them the ultimate expression of duty and honor. Others, however, saw tragedy and despair. I myself confess that I felt conflicted. Part of me admired the courage of those young men, but another part couldn't accept that we had reached this point. A pilot must fight to return, to live and fight again, not to die in an explosion. Still, who could condemn them? They were only obeying orders and believed they were defending their homeland from annihilation. The final missions became increasingly desperate. Fuel was scarce, aircraft poorly maintained, and pilot experience virtually non-existent. The enemy, on the other hand, dominated the skies with constant patrols and increasingly precise radar. When our kamikazes approached, they were detected miles away. Many were shot down before even reaching their target. Still, hundreds continued to take off and die. There was a paradoxical feeling in the air. Pride and sadness mingled. Each departure was accompanied by silent tears, but also by reverence. Deep down, we all knew that those young men were not only fighting for Japan, but for an idea of honor that no longer made sense in a world dominated by machines and industry. It was the end of the era of the Air Knight and the birth of an impersonal, mechanical industrial war. I remember the night when one of my squad mates, a young man named Harada, came up to me and said, "Senpai, if I die tomorrow, tell the world that I didn't do it for glory." But because there was no other way, I never forgot those words. They sum up what it was like to be a Japanese pilot at the end of the war, to fight bravely even when there was no hope left. The kamikaze pilots became the ultimate symbol of Japanese despair. They were neither monsters nor fanatics. They were young men, born believing that death could be a form of victory. And when the last of them ascended into the heavens, carrying with him the last vestige of hope, we knew the end was near. The divine wind was no longer blowing in our favor. The year was 1945, and Japan was no longer the same country that had started the war 4 years earlier. Cities were destroyed, ports blockaded, and air bases once teeming with activity now resembled metal graveyards. The vibrant sound of engines being tested, which had once represented national pride, had been replaced by the silence and distant smoke of enemy bombers. I still remember the first time I saw the B-29 Superfortress flying over Japan. They flew so high that our fighter jets rarely managed to catch up. They were enormous, impassive, and dropped tons of bombs on the cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all burned in flames night after night. From the ground, it looked like hell. From the air, it was the end of the world. Our defenses were gone. What remained of the Imperial Air Force was a shadow of its former self. The few planes we had were old, poorly repaired, and flown by inexperienced young men. Our radar was unreliable, fuel was scarce, and airfields were constantly bombed before we could even take off. I saw friends die on the runway before they could even get their planes airborne. It was like fighting an invisible enemy, an enemy that was already everywhere. The P-51 Mustang, the Mustang, which had been the star of the European skies, now patrolled the Pacific with the same efficiency. When the Mustangs began escorting the B-29s over Japan, the last hope of resistance vanished. They were fast, well-armed, and piloted by experienced men. While we flew with nearly empty tanks and failing engines, they came in coordinated squadrons, flawless, as if victory were already written before they even took off. I remember an encounter with them over Kyushu. There were only 4 of us Zeros trying to intercept an enemy formation. Before we could get close to the bombers, the Mustangs spotted us. In seconds, they swooped down on us. The skies filled with tracer rounds, and the noise of the 50 caliber machine guns was deafening. One of my comrades was hit and exploded before my eyes. Another tried to escape by diving, but his engine failed and he crashed into the sea. I survived only because I dove into the clouds and silently made my way to base, trembling, my heart beating faster than my plane's engine. When I landed, I realized there was nothing left to protect. The base was practically abandoned. The hangars were destroyed, the mechanics had no parts, the officers had no orders. Many of my comrades no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of honor, about what it meant to die with dignity. Others simply gazed at the horizon, as if waiting for a miracle that would never come. It was a strange feeling. It wasn't fear anymore, it was emptiness. All of Japan seemed weary. The people were suffering, food was scarce, and promises that the divine wind would blow again no longer convinced anyone. Even the most rigid officers began to understand that we were facing the inevitable. The Americans dominated the sea, the air, and soon they would set foot on our soil. On a cold night, as I watched the smoke-covered sky, I heard for the first time the distant sound of an explosion that didn't come from bombs. It was the Hiroshima base. Days later, we learned what had happened. None of us wanted to believe it. A single plane had destroyed an entire city. Some said it was a lie, others remained in absolute silence. But when Nagasaki came soon after, there was no doubt. The war had, in fact, ended. I didn't cry that day. I don't think any of us cried. We just stared at the ground in silence. We didn't know whether to feel relief or shame. We had fought with everything we had, courage, honor, and sacrifice. But we had lost to something we didn't even fully understand, the power of industry and modern science. The sky, which had been our home for so long, was now the enemy's domain. American planes flew over Japan no longer as invaders, but as masters of the air. And we, the pilots of the Empire, looked up knowing that this was the end of our era. The era of the Sky Warriors had ended.